He opened the door and froze. The same son who once called him a washed-up old man was now standing in the rain, broke trembling, clutching the designer suitcases he'd bragged about when he left. His wife, makeup running down her face, whispered, "Please, Dad, we have nowhere else." The old man didn't move. He just stared at them, silent, unblinking, while thunder rolled behind him like judgment itself. In that moment, mercy felt like betrayal. What happened next turned their world upside down. Subscribe for more revenge stories like this and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. He had built his life around one purpose: to give his son a life better than his own. After his wife died in that factory explosion 20 years ago, he buried his grief under grease and metal fixing engines by day and reading bedtime stories by night. The house smelled of oil and pine cleaner, a strange mix of labor and love. Every week he'd slide a few crumpled bills into an envelope labeled Ryan's Future. He skipped meals to pay for soccer cleats, worked extra shifts to afford a used laptop, and smiled through back pain so his boy could believe the world was safe and generous. Ryan grew up watching his father's hands, scarred, cracked, but steady. He used to call them magic hands, the kind that could fix anything. Back then, he believed his dad could stop storms. But somewhere along the way, storms became more interesting than the man who survived them. College changed him. Big city lights replaced porch lamps, and the son who once ran to the door when his father came home now only texted on birthdays. The father never said it out loud, but every silence felt like a small funeral. When Ryan brought home Clara for the first time, the father tried to smile. She was polished, graceful, her perfume floating ahead of her like a warning. She looked around the small living room. The old sofa, the framed photo of a younger man holding a fishing rod, and her lips curved, not in a smile but in assessment. The father noticed. He always noticed. That evening, she complimented the house with words that sounded more like pity. "It's cozy," she said. The father nodded and kept serving meatloaf, pretending not to feel the invisible line that had been drawn across the table. Months passed. The son started talking differently, his words coated in ambition and borrowed arrogance. He wore expensive shoes now, and when his father offered him coffee, he declined politely but distantly, as if caffeine from this kitchen was somehow beneath him. The father didn't confront him. He'd learned long ago that love sometimes meant silence, even when silence hurt. But that night, lying in bed, he stared at the ceiling and whispered to the dark, "She's changing him." When the layoffs hit the auto shop, the father didn't tell Ryan. Pride was a quiet thing, heavy and invisible. He pawned his tools to cover Ryan's last tuition payment. When the diploma arrived in the mail, he held it in both hands like a sacred relic, even though Ryan didn't come home for graduation. He just sent a text. "Thanks, Dad. Couldn't have done it without you." The words should have warmed him, but they felt cold, typed gratitude, hollow and quick. Years later, when Ryan returned with Clara, they weren't the same people. They arrived in a silver car that gleamed like money, carrying suitcases that matched their ambition. Clara walked in first, her eyes scanning the walls as if she were choosing which to repaint. Ryan followed, smiling too broadly, too briefly. They stayed for dinner, but every question from his father felt like an intrusion. "How's work?" "Fine." "You eating well?" "We're doing great, Dad." The we hit harder than expected. When they said they'd be staying just a few weeks, the father nodded. He turned the old guest room into a small haven for them. Fresh sheets, new curtains, even a bowl of fruit on the dresser. But soon the air changed. Clara complained about the creaky floors, about the draft by the window, about how small-town life was suffocating. Ryan laughed along, not cruelly but carelessly, and that hurt more. He overheard them one night in the kitchen. Clara's voice was sharp. "Your father means well, but you can't live like this forever. We need something better. My mother said she could get us into her circle, but we can't drag this place with us." Ryan didn't argue. He just sighed and said, "He's proud, Clara. He won't take it well." Her reply sliced through the dark. "Then don't ask. Just go." The next morning the father found their room empty. A note on the table read, "We love you, Dad. Don't worry, we'll visit soon." There was no return address. He stood there holding that note with greasy fingers, the ink smudging as if it couldn't bear the weight of its own lie. That day the auto shop called to say they'd found his old wrench set in a locker, rusted but still solid. He took it as a sign. He wasn't done yet. 3 years of silence followed. He aged, but didn't crumble. He learned to cook for one, to talk to the radio when the nights got too long, to rebuild engines just to keep his hands busy. He fixed an old Chevy truck that no one wanted and sold it for enough to replace the roof. He never said it aloud, but he built that house not for comfort anymore, but for defiance. Then came the rumor. Someone at the local diner mentioned seeing Ryan on the news laid off, broke the company he worked for, folding overnight. The father said nothing, only stirred his coffee slowly, the spoon clinking against the mug like a ticking clock. He went home that evening and sat by the window watching the rain streak the glass. Somewhere deep inside he felt the world shifting again. When the knock came months later, he knew before opening the door. Ryan stood there, soaked to the bone, Clara behind him with mascara bleeding down her cheeks, holding those same designer suitcases. The father stared at them, his face unreadable. Ryan started to speak, but no words came. The rain pounded harder, drumming against the porch like a warning. Dad, Ryan finally said, voice breaking, "We lost everything. Please, just for a few days." The father didn't answer. He stepped aside, but not to invite them in. His silence was its own kind of power. The son looked at him, truly looked at him, and for the first time saw the man, not the worker, not the provider, but the father who had built him from the ground up. That night after they left, the father sat by the fireplace, the glow lighting the lines on his face like scars of survival. He thought about mercy, about love, about how both can destroy you if given too freely. Somewhere between forgiveness and revenge, he found peace. But as the embers dimmed, his eyes hardened. There were still debts unpaid, not in money but in lessons. And before this story ends, one thing will become clear. The old man's patience wasn't weakness. It was the calm before the reckoning. The first time she walked through that door, she filled the room with perfume strong enough to choke the smell of coffee and motor oil that had lived in that house for 30 years. Her heels clicked across the hardwood like punctuation marks, sharp and deliberate. She smiled, but her eyes were scanning, taking inventory. Every chipped frame, every old photograph, every mark on the wall seemed to offend her. She ran a manicured hand over the back of the couch like she was brushing off dust that wasn't there. The father saw all of it and said nothing. He simply handed her a cup of coffee and watched her hold it like a foreign object, careful not to let it touch her nails. She talked too much that first evening. About the city, about the people she knew, about restaurants with French names that meant nothing to him. She laughed in a way that filled the space but emptied it at the same time. The father nodded, forcing a smile. Ryan sat beside her, proud, as if bringing her home proved he'd climbed higher than the life his father had built. When Clara complimented the neighborhood with words that sounded like pity, the father excused himself and went to refill the coffee pot he didn't need to refill. From the kitchen, he listened. "She's different," Ryan said softly, almost apologetic. "She likes nice things." "Nice things," Clara echoed, her voice coated in sugar and venom. "Your dad's house has character, though. Rustic. Like something out of an old photo album." He could hear Ryan's low laugh, uncertain, searching for approval. The father stared at the old family clock ticking above the sink. Each second felt like a warning. Weeks later, they started visiting more often. Clara always arrived with a new complaint disguised as a joke. "It's so quaint here," she'd say, wrinkling her nose at the floral curtains his late wife had sewn by hand. "Do you ever think about updating?" she'd ask, her tone playful but her meaning cruel. Ryan began echoing her thoughts little by little until his father realized the woman's voice had become the background music of his son's mind. She had a way of making Ryan feel both superior and ashamed at once. She'd glance at the old man's work boots by the door, and then at Ryan's polished shoes like she was measuring the distance between them. When the father caught her looking at the family photo on the mantel, the one with Ryan covered in mud from their fishing trip, she smirked. "Cute," she said. "You used to be quite the country boy." Ryan looked embarrassed, almost defensive. "Dad always liked simple things," he muttered. "He doesn't really get city life." That was the first time he spoke about his father, as if he weren't in the room. The poison didn't come fast. It crept in quietly like humidity, slow and visible, suffocating. Clara started bringing little gifts, the kind that insulted more than they pleased a modern clock that didn't match the room, a silver vase that clashed with the worn oak furniture. Each item replaced a piece of the house's soul. Ryan helped hang the clock without asking, smiling proudly, and the old man said nothing. But that night when they left, he took it down and buried it in the garage behind a box of tools. He wasn't angry, just tired of watching his home shrink under someone else's taste. The day she offered to help decorate for Thanksgiving, he knew it was over. She arrived early, her arms full of bags, and took over the kitchen like she'd been living there for years. She replaced his cast-iron skillet with her non-stick pan, tossed out the cornbread because it smelled too heavy, and whispered to Ryan about how the old place could use a woman's touch. The father watched from the doorway, silent and visible. When dinner was served, Clara raised her glass and said, "To family and new beginnings." The father lifted his cup of coffee and met her eyes. "New beginnings usually mean something has to end," he said. Her smile froze for just a second, and in that flicker of discomfort he found his first small victory. Over time, Ryan's visits became more about convenience than care. He'd stop by to borrow tools or to use his father's truck. Clara always waited in the car, sunglasses on, scrolling through her phone. She didn't come inside anymore, not after the father stopped pretending to like her cooking or her comments. Ryan began calling less, too. When he did, his voice carried that rehearsed warmth people use when they've already decided they're too busy for you. "Clara's got this new project," he'd say. "We'll come by soon." Soon never came. One night, long after the phone had stopped ringing, the father saw their names flash on the local news. It wasn't scandal, just an interview at some charity event in the city. Clara was radiant, dressed in silver, her hand looped through Ryan's arm like possession. "We believe in giving back," she told the reporter, smiling with her whole face but not her eyes. Ryan nodded beside her, repeating her words like a trained echo. The father turned off the TV halfway through. The room went dark except for the faint reflection of his own face in the screen, a man who had given everything and raised a stranger. Months later, a postcard arrived. A picture of a beachfront property, all glass and sunlight. On the back, Ryan had written, "You'd love it here, Dad. Maybe one day we'll bring you down." The handwriting was neat, unfamiliar. The father placed the card on the kitchen table and stared at it until the evening shadows swallowed it whole. That night he dreamed of his wife again. She was standing in the garden, her hands in the soil, saying, "Watch the roots, not the flowers. The flowers always lie." He woke before dawn, sweating, and walked outside barefoot, letting the cold air cut through him. The garden was quiet, overgrown, but alive. He started noticing the silence differently after that, how peaceful it was when no one was trying to fix what wasn't broken. He cleaned the garage, rebuilt a carburetor, painted the porch. Every sound of labor was a reminder that the house still had a heartbeat, and so did he. But the calm didn't last. One afternoon he saw a car pull into the driveway, sleek, black, expensive. Ryan stepped out first, then Clara, carrying a small leather folder. They looked different this time. Confident. Intentional. "Dad," Ryan said, "we wanted to talk about the house." Clara's smile returned that perfect, poisonous curve. "It's such a beautiful property," she began. "But it's just too much for one person, don't you think?" The father didn't answer. He watched the wind lift the corner of the welcome mat, watched a leaf spin across the porch like a warning. He knew that tone, that look, that false concern. It wasn't a visit. It was a move. The storm had finally arrived. And what happened after that meeting wasn't just a conversation, it was the start of a quiet war that neither of them would ever forget. They arrived with promises of gratitude and short stays, suitcases full of expensive clothes, and empty intentions. "Just until we get on our feet," Clara had said, flashing that rehearsed smile that could melt marble, but not him. The father nodded, though his gut whispered the truth. No one who moved in with silk robes and designer shoes was planning to leave soon. The first week was polite, almost civil. She complimented his coffee, called the house cozy, and pretended to appreciate the quiet hum of small-town life. But by the second week her tone changed, and with it the air inside those walls. It began with the kitchen. "Does this oven even heat evenly?" she said one morning, tapping the dial like it had insulted her manicure. The father glanced up from his newspaper. "It's worked fine for 20 years, he said calmly. She laughed, the kind of laugh that's meant to belittle, not amuse. "Maybe for casseroles and chili, sure. But some of us enjoy food that doesn't taste like a truck stop." Ryan looked up briefly, then down again. He didn't defend his father, didn't disagree. He just sat there, his silence louder than any insult. By the third week, Clara had turned the house into a museum of her discontent. The curtains smelled old. The water pressure was tragic. The walls were too beige, too depressing. She walked through the house like an inspector looking for violations. She swapped his wool blanket for one that matched her aesthetic, rearranged his living room, and once, without asking, threw out a chipped coffee mug his late wife had painted decades ago. When he found it missing, she smiled and said, "Oh, that thing. It was stained and cracked. I did you a favor." The father's hands tightened around the back of his chair. He wanted to shout, to demand respect, but he stopped himself. His voice had always been his temper's leash, and he wasn't about to let her break it. Instead, he cleaned the counters after she cooked her fancy meals, the ones that left the kitchen reeking of truffle oil and disdain. He fixed the leaky faucet she complained about, replaced the light bulb she said made her skin look sallow, and repaired the loose step on the porch she called dangerous. It wasn't kindness. It was survival. At night he heard them whispering in the next room. Clara's voice sharp and restless, Ryan's lower, defeated. "He means well," Ryan would mumble. "He's just old-fashioned." Old-fashioned. That word stuck like a splinter. Once being old-fashioned meant dependable, strong, a man who built things with his hands and paid his debts in full. Now it was an insult, something to be corrected, pitied, erased. One Saturday morning, Clara brought home scented candles that made the house smell like a department store. She placed them on his wife's dresser, right beside a framed wedding photo. "The old scent was too heavy," she said lightly. "This feels fresher." The father stood in the doorway, staring at the candles flickering beside that photo, the wax dripping like time bleeding away. "She liked the old scent," he said quietly. Clara turned unfazed. "Yes, but she's not here anymore, is she?" The silence that followed was ice cold. Ryan tried to keep peace, but he did it by surrendering. He stopped eating his father's meals, claiming Clara had dietary restrictions. He offered polite excuses for her absence at dinner, her complaints about the noise from the TV, her migraines whenever his father played old records. One evening when the father turned on the radio, Clara snapped, "Do you have to listen to that ancient stuff?" The old man turned the volume up one notch, his face calm but his eyes burning. "Some of us still like remembering what music sounded like when people had souls," he said. Ryan stood up from the couch, muttered something about needing air, and walked out the door. Clara just rolled her eyes. Days bled into weeks, and the house, his house, no longer felt like his own. She began leaving her things everywhere, her scarf draped across his recliner, her perfume bottles crowding the bathroom sink, her shoes blocking the hallway. Every inch she took was another quiet eviction. He found himself apologizing in his own home, moving aside in his own hallway, lowering the TV volume in his own living room. Every time he did, a piece of him disappeared. The neighbors started to notice. One afternoon, Mrs. Callahan from across the street brought over a pie, her eyes darting nervously between the father and Clara. "Haven't seen you at the diner lately," she said. Clara answered for him. "He's been busy. We're helping him modernize a bit." Mrs. Callahan smiled politely, but her eyes said what her lips didn't. "She's taken over." When the door closed, Clara sniffed. "That woman's pie crust is awful." But the father wasn't blind to the shift happening in Ryan. The boy who once hugged him with pride now avoided his gaze. When Clara wasn't in the room, Ryan would mumble small apologies. "She just likes things a certain way," he'd say. The father would nod, pretending to believe him, though deep down he knew Ryan's backbone had been traded for comfort. The love he'd built for his son wasn't dying, it was being poisoned slowly, and Ryan was letting it happen. Then came the breaking point. One evening, after Clara had spent all day criticizing the paint color, the clutter, the ugly couch, she looked around and said, "You know, Ryan, this place could sell for a good price if your dad ever wanted to move somewhere. Smaller. Somewhere more manageable." The father froze mid-step. "I'm not selling my home," he said. Clara turned toward him, her expression syrupy sweet. "Of course not. I didn't mean now, but think about it. You could live near us, maybe in one of those retirement communities with better amenities." Ryan didn't defend him. He didn't say a word. That silence spoke volumes louder than any argument. The father set his coffee cup down on the counter and walked to the back porch. The sun was setting, throwing a thin line of red across the sky, and for the first time in years he felt small inside his own home. The air outside was cooler, honest. He stood there for a long time, the sounds of laughter echoing faintly from the living room. That night he packed away the last few things that still belonged solely to him: his wife's locket, a few old letters, the photo of Ryan as a child with a fishing pole twice his size. He placed them in a box and slid it under his bed, not out of fear of losing them, but because he knew what was coming next. The poison wasn't just in her words anymore. It was in the way the house felt smaller, the way his son's footsteps no longer sounded like family. Something was breaking quietly and completely. And when the moment finally came, when she pushed just one step too far, he would be ready not with anger, but with something colder, sharper, and far more final. The day the invitation came, it wasn't written, it was performed. Vivian Carter arrived in a black town car that gleamed like polished sin, stepping out in a silk coat the color of champagne. She didn't knock. She announced herself with the sound of her heels and the scent of money. Her smile was sharp, her eyes colder than the jewelry around her neck. "Ryan," she said sweetly, "I've been thinking. You and Clara shouldn't have to struggle. I have more space than I can use. Why not come stay with me for a while? It's time you lived the life you deserve." The father stood by the window, silent, watching as the bait was dangled and taken in one smooth motion. Ryan didn't even hesitate. His pupils widened the moment the word estate left her lips. Clara looked at her mother, then at Ryan, and smiled like someone who had already won. The father saw it all, the flash of hunger behind his son's polite expression, the relief of a man who wanted to escape the gravity of humility. That night the house felt different. The air was restless, like it knew something was ending. Ryan packed neatly, humming under his breath, folding shirts as though preparing for a vacation, not an abandonment. Clara moved through the house like a storm, collecting souvenirs. She gathered her things, but she also took more Ryan's attention, his loyalty, and the fragile remnants of peace. She spoke loudly on the phone with her mother, laughing, her words slicing through the quiet like glass. "Yes, Mother, it'll be a relief for him, too. It's not easy living in a place that still smells like the past." The father sat at the kitchen table, watching the clock tick toward midnight. The lamp cast a warm circle of light, but everything beyond it felt cold. When Ryan finally walked in, he had that look, half guilt, half justification. "Dad," he started, forcing a smile. "You know this isn't about leaving you. It's just an opportunity. Clara's mom has connections. It could help me build something bigger." The father nodded slowly, his eyes calm but unreadable. "Bigger," he repeated. "Just make sure what you're building can stand without someone else's foundation." Ryan didn't respond. He just kept packing. Later that night they had dinner together for the last time. The meal was simple: baked chicken, potatoes, and a bottle of cheap wine that had been waiting for a better occasion. Clara barely touched her plate. She scrolled through her phone, sighing when notifications buzzed. Ryan tried to make conversation, but the silence between them was a canyon. The father didn't fill it. He let it echo. When they finished, he took their plates, washed them, and said, "You're leaving early, I assume?" Ryan nodded. "Vivian's sending the car at 8. Morning came gray and damp. The driveway gleamed with rain, the world smelling of wet earth and goodbye. The car arrived on time, sleek, spotless, the kind of vehicle that didn't belong on his road. Vivian stepped out again, all smiles and pearls, greeting her daughter with open arms, and her son-in-law with ownership disguised as affection. "My darling children," she said, kissing Clara on the cheek, her perfume heavy enough to stain the air. Then she turned to the father, her expression cooling. "You've done well, Mr. Harris. Ryan's such a fine man. You must be proud." He looked at her for a long moment. "Pride's not something I give away easily," he said. Vivian's smile flickered but recovered. She wasn't used to being answered, especially not by men without money. "Well," she said briskly, "we'll take good care of him." Her voice made it sound like ownership papers were being signed right there on the porch. Ryan loaded the last suitcase into the trunk and turned toward his father. "I'll visit," he promised, his tone uncertain. The father studied him, seeing the boy he once carried on his shoulders and the man who now avoided his gaze. "Just remember who built your first roof," he said quietly, "and who'll be standing under it when the rain comes back." Ryan nodded, but the words slid off him like water off polished stone. Then came Clara's parting shot. She adjusted her sunglasses, flashed that cruel empty grin, and said, "Don't worry, old man. We'll send you a postcard from the mansion." As she opened the car door, she added louder, "Try not to rot in this dusty old place." Ryan didn't stop her. He didn't even flinch. That was the moment the father understood the boy he'd raised was gone. He stood on the porch as the car disappeared down the long road, the taillights shrinking into nothing. The rain began again, soft at first, then steady, drumming against the roof like a pulse. He stayed there until his coffee went cold, watching the space they'd left behind. Inside, the house felt larger but emptier, the kind of quiet that hums. The days that followed were strange. He found Clara's perfume lingering in the hallway, her forgotten scarf draped over a chair. He threw it in the trash without hesitation. Ryan called once, that weak voice, cheerful, echoing faintly through the receiver. "Dad, you should see this place. There's a pool, a guest house, even a private theater. Vivian says she'll introduce me to some investors." The father listened, nodding to words that meant nothing. "Sounds nice," he said. "Remember to keep your hands dirty once in a while. That's how you know you're still working for something real." Ryan laughed awkwardly. "You and your sayings, Dad." After that, the calls became fewer. Months passed. The father stayed busy repairing the roof, repainting the porch, mowing the lawn until the blades shone in the sun. People in town asked about Ryan, and he always said the same thing. He's doing fine. He's where he wants to be. But at night, he'd catch the local news, see a flash of Ryan's face beside Vivian's at charity galas, his smile rehearsed, his eyes dimmer each time. Then one morning a letter arrived. The envelope was thick, the handwriting neat. Inside was a formal notice. Vivian Carter had listed Ryan as a co-signer on a new business venture. Luxury property, high risk. The kind of deal that buried men faster than time ever could. The father read it twice, then folded it neatly and placed it beside his coffee cup. He didn't call. He didn't warn him. Some lessons, he thought, had to be paid in full. Weeks later, the phone rang again. Ryan's voice trembled this time. "Dad, things didn't go as planned. Vivian's company, there were issues." She's blaming me." The father leaned back in his chair, watching the wind shake the trees outside. "You built your own life, son," he said quietly. "Now hold it up." The silence that followed was heavy. Then came the smallest sound, a sigh, broken, defeated. That night, as he sat on the porch, the sky turning red with sunset, he thought of Clara's words, that cruel farewell. He smiled a small, knowing smile and whispered to the empty air, rot in that dusty old house. Huh? He took a slow sip of coffee, the bitterness settling just right. He had built that house with his hands brick by brick, and though time had tried to wear it down, it still stood strong. The mansion might have been bigger, brighter, filled with luxury, but this place, his place, had something none of them understood. It had roots, and when roots run deep enough, they always outlast the storm. But the storm, he knew, wasn't done yet. Something was coming, something that would drag every lie, every betrayal back to the surface. And when it did, the house on the hill wouldn't be the one left standing. The silence didn't just fill the house, it occupied it. It moved through the halls, settled on the furniture, and whispered in the corners at night. Every morning he'd make 2 cups of coffee out of habit, then pour one down the sink. The clock on the wall ticked louder now, not marking time, but reminding him that no one was coming back. 3 months felt like 3 winters. The phone stayed still, the mailbox empty, and the world outside kept moving like nothing had changed. But everything had. The first rumor came from the post office clerk, an old woman with kind eyes and a cruel mouth. "I heard your boy's living up in the Carter estate," she said, sealing an envelope like she was closing a coffin. "They say it's real fancy indoor pool. Private chef, the works. Good for him, huh?" He smiled thinly, said nothing, and left. By the time he reached home, the smile had cracked. The second came from the diner. 2 men at the counter whispered just loud enough for him to hear. "That's the one. The old guy who got ditched." Their laughter was quiet but sharp, like glass breaking inside him. He finished his meal, left a tip larger than the bill, and walked out without a word. It was the graffiti that broke the last of his patience. The abandoned father's house scrawled across his fence in red spray paint letters, uneven but full of malice. He stood there under the porch light, his hands trembling not from anger but from something deeper. Humiliation, the kind that eats at your bones. He fetched a bucket, filled it with hot water and soap, and began scrubbing. The paint didn't come off easily, neither did the ache. Each stroke scraped more than wood. It stripped years of pride, of faith, of forgiveness. By the time he finished, the water had turned the color of rust and sorrow. He sat on the steps, breathing hard, staring at the clean fence that now looked like a scar. The next morning, he went back to the routine because routine was survival. He fixed the gate hinge, mowed the lawn, oiled the squeaky door, kept the place alive like a body refusing to die. The neighbors watched from a distance, their pity disguised as kindness. "You doing okay, Bill?" one of them asked. "You should visit your son sometime." He nodded, but his eyes stayed cold. "If a man walks away from his home, he's the one who should visit," he said, and walked back inside. At night, he sat by the window with a cup of coffee and the radio humming low. He'd picture Ryan in that mansion, crystal chandeliers, polished floors, the smell of money covering the stench of guilt. Clara would be there too, lounging in silk, laughing at something her mother said. He could almost hear her voice, smug and hollow. "Isn't it nice to be free of all that small-town baggage?" The thought made his jaw tighten. He didn't hate them. Not yet. Hate was too simple. What he felt was heavier, a quiet, deliberate kind of rage that waited. Then came the storm. A real one, rolling over the hills, one Friday evening, wind howling through the cracks of the old house. The power went out, plunging everything into darkness. He lit a candle and sat on the porch, watching the rain hammer the road. The thunder shook the windows, but inside him there was only calm. He thought of the factory where his wife had died, how one spark had turned a lifetime of work into ash. That night felt the same. Something inside him had sparked, and the rest of him was waiting to burn. The next morning he drove into town, bought new paint, new tools, new locks. He didn't tell anyone why. He repainted the fence, not white, but deep gray, the color of steel. The words were gone, but he left a small patch unpainted, a reminder of what people saw when they looked at him. Not a victim, but a man rebuilding from ruin. Weeks turned into months, and the silence stretched thinner, ready to snap. Then the letters started arriving, bills not meant for him. Property taxes, business notices all addressed to Ryan, but sent to his old home by mistake. One envelope bore the Carter name. He opened it carefully. Inside was a formal statement from a law firm in Detroit. Something about unpaid loans, defaulted accounts, and property disputes. The mansion wasn't as perfect as it looked from the road. He didn't call. He didn't warn. He folded the letter, tucked it into the drawer beside his late wife's locket, and whispered, "Let the storm do what it does best." A week later, a black SUV slowed near his house. He watched from the porch as a man in a suit stepped out, checked the address, and frowned before driving off. That same evening, the local news mentioned a financial scandal involving the Carter estate. The report was brief, polite, but the subtext was clear: fraud, debt, betrayal. He poured himself a drink and raised it toward the flickering screen. "You wanted a mansion, son," he murmured. "Hope you like the view from the bottom." But even as satisfaction stirred, there was something else. A hollow ache, the ghost of love refusing to die. He spent that night awake, walking through the house, touching the walls, the photographs, the spaces that once echoed with laughter. For the first time, he admitted what he hadn't dared say aloud: he missed his son. Not the man Ryan had become, but the boy who used to leave muddy footprints in the hallway and fall asleep on the couch after dinner. The next morning, he drove out to the edge of town where the hills met the highway. From there, he could see the Carter estate in the distance, large, impressive, lifeless. The gates were locked, the driveway empty. A single foreclosure notice hung crooked on the mailbox. He sat in his truck for a long while, watching the wind tear at the paper. He should have felt vindicated. Instead, he felt old. On the drive home, he passed by a store window that caught his reflection. He didn't see the poor old man anymore. He saw something steadier, sharper, a man who'd stopped begging for love that had already left him. By the time he reached the house, the sun was setting, painting everything in gold. He stood by the clean gray fence, the one that had once been defaced, and smiled faintly. Then, just as he was about to go inside, he saw headlights at the end of the road. A car slowing down, the engine humming uncertainly. He waited, heart steady, until it turned into his driveway. He recognized it instantly. The same luxury car that had once carried his son away was now crawling back, its shine dulled by dirt and time. He didn't move. He just watched. The door opened and Ryan stepped out. Thinner, older, the weight of pride finally gone from his shoulders. Clara followed, no makeup, her eyes hollow. The father didn't speak. He let the rain begin again, soft and steady, washing over all three of them. And as Ryan took one hesitant step forward, the old man's silence said everything words never could. What happened next would not be forgiveness. It would be something far more honest. The house had stood silent for months, its walls dulled by dust and memory. But one morning before the sun rose, he woke with purpose. There was no grand decision, no speech, no epiphany. Just a quiet understanding: if he kept waiting for someone to return, he would rot right alongside the wood. So he got up, rolled his sleeves, and began. The smell of old paint and soil filled the air, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like a ghost living inside someone else's story. The first thing he fixed was the porch railing. It had splintered from years of weather and neglect, a jagged reminder of how time eats what you don't protect. He sanded it down, each stroke steady and deliberate, until the wood felt smooth beneath his fingers. By noon, the boards gleamed in fresh varnish. He stood back, sweat running down his neck, the hammer still warm in his grip. It wasn't much, but it was his. Next came the walls. He stripped away the faded wallpaper Clara had once mocked beige and boring, and painted them deep forest green. The color reminded him of his wife's garden of life, that thrived quietly without anyone's applause. The work was slow, his joints stiff, but he refused to stop. Each brushstroke was a declaration. I'm still here. When the paint dried, he turned to the garden. The soil was hard, stubborn, like it had forgotten how to breathe. He dug until blisters opened on his palms, then planted new flowers, lavender, marigolds, and roses the color of sunset. Neighbors passed by, curious. Some waved, others whispered. He didn't care. The garden began to bloom again, color crawling back into a world that had gone gray. At night he sat on the porch with a cup of black coffee, staring at those small bursts of life glowing under the moonlight. It was quiet, but not empty. Inside he tore down old curtains that had hung like shadows over the windows. He replaced them with simple white ones, light enough for the morning sun to spill through. The light touched everything. The chipped table, the framed photograph of his wife, the creases in his hands, and for the first time the house didn't look like a tomb. It looked like home again. Every repair carried a story. The loose tile in the kitchen floor, he remembered Ryan dropping a toy car there when he was 5. The broken lamp by the hallway, his wife had hated its crooked shade, but he'd kept it anyway. He fixed them both, not out of nostalgia, but out of respect for the man he used to be, the one who built things instead of waiting for others to destroy them. As the weeks passed, he found himself waking earlier, eating better, even whistling sometimes while he worked. His hands ached constantly, but the pain felt honest. It reminded him he was still capable, still useful, still more than what the world or his son believed. He began cooking again, real meals this time. No more canned soup or frozen dinners. He roasted chicken, baked bread, simmered stews the way his wife used to. The smell of rosemary and garlic filled the kitchen, crawling through the house like a resurrection. He even set the table for 2 out of habit, and when he noticed he didn't remove the extra plate, he just let it sit there, a silent nod to everything he'd loved and lost. People started noticing the changes. The mailman complimented the new paint job. A young couple moving in next door asked for gardening advice. Even Mrs. Callahan from across the street dropped off a pie, pretending it was just extra, though he knew better. He accepted it with a small grin. "Looks like you're living again," she said softly. "Didn't realize I ever stopped," he replied. At night he sat by the fireplace, the same place he'd once drowned in silence, and now it hummed with warmth. He kept a journal on the table, something his wife had always meant to do but never did. In it, he wrote simple things: the color of the sky, the first bloom of the lavender, the sound of rain on the roof. Small miracles, he called them. Proof that life wasn't done giving as long as you didn't stop taking. One evening, while sorting through the old drawer in his wife's study, he found a sealed envelope addressed in her handwriting. His breath caught. The date was from years before her death. He hesitated, then opened it. Inside was a short note written in her tidy, confident script. "When the house feels too big, fill it with purpose, not people." He sat there for a long time, the note trembling slightly in his hands. It felt like she was still guiding him, whispering through time. He smiled, folded the paper carefully, and tucked it into his wallet. From that night on, his work became more than maintenance. It became devotion. He installed new shelves in the hallway, refinished the floors, even replaced the old mailbox that had rusted with time. On the new one, he stenciled a single word: Harris. His name. His legacy. The seasons shifted quietly. The summer heat softened into fall, the air thick with the smell of cut grass and burning leaves. He stacked firewood behind the house, humming to himself. The fence he'd once scrubbed in anger now stood proud and strong, painted the same deep gray as the sky before a storm. He didn't think about Ryan much anymore, not in the way he used to. There was no anger left, no expectation. Just a hollow space where something used to be. And yet sometimes, when the wind moved through the trees just right, he thought he could hear a boy's laughter echoing from the past, the sound of innocence before greed took its place. Then came the night he found the message on his voicemail. The voice was quiet, strained, almost broken. "Dad, it's me. I know I don't deserve it, but I need to talk to you." He replayed it twice, his thumb hovering over the phone. The voice was older, thinner, but it was his son. He didn't call back. Not yet. Instead, he walked outside, the cool air biting at his skin. The moon hung low, pale and watchful. The garden glowed faintly in the silver light, the flowers swaying like they were breathing. He looked at the house, his house standing strong against the dark. For the first time, he felt untouchable. Not because he was alone, but because he had rebuilt himself from the ruins without needing permission, apology, or forgiveness. And somewhere deep down, he knew the story wasn't over. The silence before the next knock on the door would decide what kind of man he truly was. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon, cutting through the stillness like a blade. He almost didn't answer. The number flashed unfamiliar, but something deep inside him, something that still remembered a boy's laughter echoing through these same walls, made him pick up. The moment he heard the voice, that half-broken mix of arrogance and desperation, he knew. Ryan. There was no greeting, no trace of the son he'd raised, just a clipped breath and a hollow sentence. Dad, I need $5,000. No explanation, no emotion, just the transaction of someone who'd forgotten that blood ever meant something. He didn't respond right away. He let the silence stretch heavy and uncomfortable, the kind that made men reveal who they really were. He could almost hear Ryan fidgeting on the other end, impatient, like time itself owed him an answer. "What for?" he asked, finally, his voice calm, steady, the same tone he'd used years ago when teaching Ryan how to drive, how to change a tire, how to face the world. Only this time there was no lesson waiting, just judgment. Ryan sighed, annoyed. "It's complicated. Just a few things went wrong with the deal. I'll pay you back all right, I just need it fast. You've got it, don't you?" The father looked around the room. The house stood strong again. Fresh paint, clean walls, the faint scent of new wood polish still in the air. Everything he'd rebuilt had been done with his hands, his sweat, his pain. Every nail, every board, every drop of color was proof that he'd survived the storm his son had abandoned him in. "I do," he said quietly. "But that doesn't mean it's yours." The line went cold. For a second, there was nothing. No breath, no movement. Then came the familiar defensiveness, the sharp edge of entitlement. "Dad, don't start. You know I'll pay you back. I just need help. This isn't a big deal." He closed his eyes and leaned back in his chair, the old leather creaking beneath him. "Everything's a big deal when respect isn't part of it." Ryan's tone hardened. "So that's it? You'd let your own son drown over a few $1,000s?" He almost laughed, but the sound caught in his throat. "Son," he said softly, "I did drown once. You were the one holding the rope." A long silence followed, the kind that stripped pride from words. Then Ryan said, flat and final, "Forget it." And the line went dead. No goodbye, no thank you, just emptiness. He sat there for a moment, the phone still in his hand, the echo of that last word lingering in the air. Forget it. That was the cruelest part. His son had mastered the art of forgetting. But this time the father didn't feel broken. He didn't stare at the walls or wonder what he'd done wrong. Instead, he set the phone down, gently, walked to the window, and watched the late afternoon sun fade behind the trees. The light turned the room gold, and for the first time in years it felt like a blessing instead of a memory. He made himself a cup of coffee the way he liked it, strong, black, honest. He sat at the kitchen table, the one Clara had once called cheap. He smiled at that thought, not bitterly, but like a man who'd finally found peace in being underestimated. That no had weight. It wasn't born of anger, it was built from survival. Saying no wasn't rejection, it was reclamation. For decades he had given and given, thinking love meant sacrifice. But love without respect was just servitude. He thought about the last time Ryan had truly looked at him. It wasn't during the fight or the insults. It was years ago on a fishing trip when Ryan had caught his first bass. The boy had turned to him, eyes wide with pride, holding the wriggling fish like treasure. "We did it, Dad," he'd shouted. "We." That was the last time they'd been on the same side of the sentence. He sipped his coffee slowly, letting the warmth settle in his chest. Outside, a light rain began to fall, tapping softly against the window pane. He watched it in silence, feeling the rhythm steady his heartbeat. There was no grief now, no fury, only clarity. Ryan's call wasn't a cry for help. It was a test of how much control he still had, how much guilt still lingered. But this time, the old man had chosen differently. The boy had taken his money, his patience, his pride. But not this time. This time he kept what mattered. That night as he lay in bed, he didn't think about Ryan's voice or the money or the mansion that had crumbled into debt. He thought about the garden outside, how it was finally blooming again. The lavender, the roses, the marigolds all growing despite being neglected for years. Nature didn't beg to be understood or forgiven. It simply grew when it was ready. The next morning he woke early, brewed another pot of coffee, and opened the window to let in the smell of wet earth. The world felt clean again, like it had been reset. He noticed the old radio on the counter, its dial rusted from years of use. He turned it on, and a song from his youth filled the kitchen, slow, soulful, something his wife used to hum while cooking Sunday breakfast. For the first time in a long while, he sang along. At noon, the phone rang again. He didn't move. Let it ring once, twice, then stop. No message this time. He smiled faintly. Silence was an answer, too. Later that evening, he walked out to the porch, a book under his arm, and watched the sun dip low over the horizon. The air was cool, sweet, almost forgiving. He thought of Ryan somewhere out there, chasing comfort, tripping over his own pride. He hoped his son would learn what he'd finally understood, that money fixes roofs, not hearts. The light began to fade, turning the garden into silhouettes. He closed his eyes and let the wind move through him. Somewhere far away, a storm was gathering. He could feel it, not fear, but inevitability. Something was shifting. And when that storm reached his door again, he wouldn't be the same man who once begged for love or understanding. The next time they spoke, he wouldn't have to raise his voice. His silence alone would be enough to tell his son exactly what kind of man he had become. The rain came hard that night, the kind that blurred the line between heaven and earth. The sky cracked open, and the sound of thunder rolled through the valley like an old debt being collected. He was sitting by the fire when the knock came, 3 sharp hits against the door. Not timid, not desperate. Familiar. Too familiar. He didn't move at first. The sound of the rain hitting the roof drowned out everything but memory. He already knew who it was. There was a rhythm to the knock, the same pattern Ryan used when he was a boy coming home late from curfew. 2 knocks, a pause, then one more like a plea. He stared into the fire a moment longer, the wood-popping sparks rising like ghosts of old regrets. When he finally stood, he felt no rush, no dread, no softness. Just a stillness that had taken him years to earn. He opened the door slowly. There they were, Ryan and Clara, soaked to the bone, clothes clinging to them, faces drawn and pale. The shine that once followed them like perfume was gone. Ryan's eyes darted away the moment their gazes met. Clara, stripped of her arrogance, looked smaller. Somehow the sharpness of her beauty dulled by reality. The rain plastered her hair to her face, mascara streaking down her cheeks. She opened her mouth first. "Dad," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Please. We didn't know where else to go." Ryan tried to speak, but the words died in his throat. His hands were empty. No briefcase, no keys, no pride, just emptiness. The father leaned against the doorframe, his expression unreadable. The storm behind them howled like it wanted to swallow them whole. For a moment, he almost pitied them, almost. Then he remembered every night he'd waited by the phone, every insult disguised as sophistication, every silence that had felt like punishment. He didn't invite them in. "You're standing in the same place you left me," he said quietly. "Difference is I learned how to live here." Ryan took a step forward, water dripping from his coat. "Dad, please. Just for tonight. We've lost everything. The business collapsed. Vivian's gone." "We didn't know—" "I know," he interrupted. His voice was calm, deliberate, steady as a hammer striking wood. "You knew what you were building. You just didn't believe it could fall." Clara flinched, her lower lip trembling. "We were wrong. We made mistakes. But we're family." He shook his head. "Family doesn't show up when the roof leaks. Family helps build it before the rain comes." Lightning flashed, illuminating their faces. Ryan's eyes, once so certain now, looked like the eyes of a child who had seen too much too fast. The father saw himself in that look for a fleeting moment, the boy he'd raised, not the man who'd sold him out. But that wasn't enough. Not anymore. "This house," he said slowly, "used to be a place where I begged to be heard, where I worked myself raw so others could live easy. Not anymore. This house is my sanctuary now. It's not a shelter for regret." Ryan's shoulders sagged, his voice barely a whisper. "Then where do we go?" He didn't answer. He simply stepped back, closed the door, and turned the deadbolt with one clean motion. The sound echoed through the hall like a gunshot. Outside, the storm raged on. Through the crack in the curtains, he could see their silhouettes, two figures standing in the rain, unmoving, waiting for mercy. That wasn't coming. He stood there watching, not out of cruelty, but out of closure. Every man has to face the consequences of his own choices. Minutes passed. Then slowly, the shapes moved away, disappearing into the darkness. The road swallowed them whole. He exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding for years. The fire was still burning when he returned to his chair. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, the good one he kept for special nights, and raised it toward the door. Not in toast, not in victory, just acknowledgement. For the first time he felt light. There was no guilt left, no anger, just a hollow space where pain used to live. He sat there until the storm began to fade, the rain softening into a whisper. Later that night, when the sky cleared, he stepped onto the porch. The air was sharp and clean, the scent of wet earth thick and grounding. The moon hung low, glinting off the puddles scattered across the yard. The world looked new again. He noticed something by the gate, a crumpled envelope half soaked by the rain. He picked it up carefully, unfolded it. Inside was a photograph. Ryan, Clara, and a little boy no older than 5. His grandson. On the back, a single line written in Ryan's shaky handwriting. "His name is Michael. He deserves better than I was." He stared at the photo for a long time, his fingers tracing the boy's smile. It was Ryan's smile from decades ago. The same one that used to light up this porch after school, the same one that had vanished when greed took its place. The old man's throat tightened. For a moment he almost called out into the night. Almost. But instead he slipped the photo into his pocket and walked back inside. The warmth of the fire met him again, steady and patient. He knew what the letter meant. This wasn't an ending, it was a reckoning. Somewhere out there a boy carried the same blood, the same stubbornness, maybe even the same chance to get it right. He looked at the empty chair across from him, the one where Ryan used to sit, and then at the fire. Maybe someday, he murmured. Then he sat down, poured another drink, and let the flames dance across the room. Outside, the wind calmed, the night stilled, and for the first time in a long time, he cried not for loss, but for liberation. But deep inside, beneath the peace and the quiet, a thought lingered like an ember refusing to die. The story wasn't finished. The past always finds its way home, and when it does not, every knock on the door brings rain. Some bring storms you never see coming. Winter had melted into spring by the time they returned. The snow had long vanished from the porch steps, replaced by early buds pushing through the soil he'd tended all season. The air smelled of pine and rain, and the house, once a hollow echo of his mistakes, now hummed with quiet strength. He had learned to live without waiting for footsteps on the gravel or voices calling from the gate. So when the knock came again, he didn't rush to the door. He simply stood still, breathing in the calm he had fought to earn. Through the window he saw them, Ryan and Clara, standing side by side, not in fine clothes this time, but in simple ones. No pretense, no jewelry, no performance. Just two people stripped bare of pride. The boy noticed the difference, first their posture. No longer demanding, no longer rehearsed. They weren't here to reclaim. They were here to return. He opened the door, but not wide, just enough to look them in the eye. Ryan spoke first. "Dad," he said quietly, "we need to talk." His voice carried none of the arrogance it once did, only fatigue. Clara clutched a folder in her hands, her fingers trembling slightly. For the first time her eyes met his without armor. They stood there for a long moment, the weight of years between them pressing down. The father finally nodded toward the porch. "You can come in," he said. It wasn't forgiveness, it was permission. Inside the house smelled of wood polish and coffee. The fire crackled low, casting soft light on the table where he'd once sat alone. Ryan looked around, taking in the fresh paint, the mended walls, the life rebuilt without him. Clara lingered near the window, her eyes falling on the garden blooming outside. "You've done a lot here," she said softly. "It's beautiful." He didn't answer. He poured 3 cups of coffee instead, setting them down carefully. Ryan didn't touch his. His hands were clasped together on the table the same way they'd been when he was a boy, caught lying about a broken window. The father almost smiled at the memory, but the moment was too fragile for nostalgia. Ryan reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope. "This is for you," he said. "It's not enough to repay what I took, but it's honest money. I earned it." He placed it on the table, the paper slightly wrinkled, edges worn. "We've been working odd jobs, whatever we could find. Clara cleaned houses. I've been fixing fences, hauling scrap. It's not much, but it's ours." The father glanced at the envelope but didn't touch it. "Money was never what you owed me," he said quietly. "I know," Ryan replied. "That's why there's something else." He opened the folder Clara had been holding and slid a document across the table. "It's a release form, legally signed. I've renounced any claim to this house, to your land, to anything with your name on it. It's yours, Dad. Always should have been." For a long time no one spoke. The only sound was the faint hiss of the fire and the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. The father reached for the document, his fingers brushing over the inked signatures. His hands trembled not from age, but from disbelief. After years of bitterness and betrayal here, it was a gesture not born of guilt but of humility. He folded the paper carefully, setting it beside the envelope. His eyes lifted to his son's. "You didn't have to do this," he said. "Yes, I did," Ryan answered. His voice cracked slightly. "Because I finally understand what this house means. You built it with your hands, your sweat, your sacrifices. I thought I could buy something better, but I was wrong. Everything I built fell apart because it didn't have roots. I came back because I want to start over. Not with your money, with your lessons." Clara's eyes glistened. "We lost everything, and maybe that's what we needed. I was so focused on what we didn't have that I forgot what mattered. You were right about me, Mr. Harris. I was poison. But I'm trying to change. We both are." The father looked at her, really looked, and for the first time saw not the arrogance or greed, but exhaustion and truth. "People don't change overnight," he said. Clara nodded. "No. But we start somewhere." He leaned back in his chair, staring at the flickering firelight. The house had once been a battleground. Now it was quiet again, not empty, but calm. He reached for the envelope, felt the weight of it in his hand, then set it down again. "Keep it," he said. "You'll need it more than I do." Ryan shook his head. "No, Dad. This time I'm not asking, I'm giving." There was a stillness, then something sacred in the simplicity of it. No dramatic apologies, no grand speeches, just the quiet exchange of understanding between two men who had finally stopped fighting the wrong war. He stood and walked to the window, watching the garden sway in the evening breeze. The colors outside looked sharper, richer somehow. Maybe it was the light, or maybe it was just peace finally settling in. "When your mother died," he said after a long pause, "I told myself I'd keep this house alive for you. But somewhere along the way, I forgot it had to be alive for me too. I think I'm done fighting ghosts." Ryan stood slowly, his eyes shining in the firelight. "I never said I was sorry," he murmured. The father turned toward him. "Then don't say it. Just be better than sorry." For the first time in years, the corners of his mouth lifted, not a smile, but close. He reached out, placing a rough, calloused hand on Ryan's shoulder. The touch was brief, but it carried more weight than words ever could. Clara watched silently, her hand covering her mouth as if afraid to disturb the fragile peace that had finally arrived. They stayed a while longer, drinking coffee in silence. When they left, the rain had started again, light and steady, washing over the porch and the garden alike. Ryan paused at the gate, glancing back one last time. The father stood in the doorway, the firelight glowing behind him like a halo of warmth. No words were exchanged. None were needed. After they disappeared into the mist, he went back inside, sat at the table and unfolded the paper once more. The ink had bled slightly from Ryan's wet hands, but the signature was still clear. He held it between his fingers, feeling the tremor of his own heartbeat. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was something close, a bridge being rebuilt plank by plank. The fire crackled softly as he whispered to no one, "Revenge didn't save me. It just gave me the space to find myself again." He looked toward the window where the rain shimmered under the porch light and breathed deeply. For the first time in a lifetime, the air didn't taste like loss. Outside, the garden bent under the rain, but the roots held firm. Somewhere down the road, the sound of an engine faded into the distance. The night was quiet again, peaceful, steady, alive. But deep in that quiet, he knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something far rarer, redemption that didn't need to be loud to be real. Life has a way of teaching us that peace doesn't come from holding on, it comes from letting go. The story reminds us that dignity and self-respect are worth more than comfort, and sometimes love must be silent to be understood. We spend so much of our lives giving our time, our sacrifices, our forgiveness, and we forget that rebuilding ourselves isn't selfish, it's survival. For older generations, this truth strikes deeper. We've carried families, endured losses, and stood tall through storms. And yet strength isn't just about endurance. It's about knowing when to stop carrying what no longer serves our hearts. The father's journey shows that revenge doesn't always mean destruction. Sometimes it's simply reclaiming peace, pride, and the right to live with grace. In the end, forgiveness isn't given to others, it's a gift we give ourselves. If you've ever rebuilt yourself after being broken or learned to find peace after being betrayed, this story is for you. Share your thoughts below. Tell us what lesson resonated most with you, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that honor wisdom, resilience, and the quiet power of justice.